Our next speaker is Mr. Pieter de Gooijer. He is a diplomat with a long career in the Foreign Service of the Netherlands. Right now he's the permanent representative of the Netherlands at the European Union. Picture his workplace. Put 28 countries, member states in a mixer and send them to Brussels. And then you have to make sense of it. And you have to figure out what the line will be for the coming 1, 2, 3, 5 or 10 years. Your job must be truly, truly difficult. And we're all looking forward to hear from you how in such an environment it is important to keep focus on the goals, the main goals of Europeans in this case, but how difficult it is with all these influences by all these countries. So Mr. de Gooijer, please, a hand for him.
Your Royal Highness, Mr. Mayor, I dare say dear Josias, because Josias used to be my boss when he was a foreign minister. And actually listening to his speech, I must say that I've heard a lot on topics that we worked on at the time that he was a minister. And that I, fortunately, am allowed still to work on some of the topics that Mr. Kurpershoek has just mentioned. I wish I had been able to listen, Joost, to your speech before I prepared my remarks, because then I could have been even more specific, responding to your dissection, so to speak, of the theme for this week. Because that's indeed where I started. I reflected a bit on the theme that you have chosen for this week, which is a complex theme. Indeed, the two elements preserving the future. The first has a sort of threat in it. Apparently, we feel that the future is threatened, and you've given examples of that. And then we have to overcome the paradox of power. Seems to me that the underlying idea behind this title or this theme for the conference is that to end conflicts, because in the explanation that I got from you, it focuses very much on conflicts. To end conflicts, especially between states, we require a structure or an institution that forces or at least induces states to compromise and to negotiate and to cooperate, and in that way to move away more than they are in themselves normally capable of doing so, to cooperate more than they would if they were indeed acting solely in their own national narrow interest. Now, given that we're here at the Model UN, the assumption then would be that it would be the UN that should provide that structure or the institution for this to ensure the desired willingness to compromise, to negotiate and to cooperate. Yes, the UN has that ambition. Undoubtedly you all read the Charter and read an awful lot more. I understand that most of you are already master students or preparing for their PhD. So you've read that and a lot more. And the UN does seem at first sight to have the structure that is commensurate with the ambition that I just described. It has universal membership, virtually. It has an executive council that is the sole competent organization in the world or organ in the world to deal with war and peace. It has the monopoly to use power in international conflict, to use military power in armed conflict. There is the legal context. The mayor spoke, and Joost, you too, about the ICJ, which is the ultimate legal authority on conflicts between states. And then there is the International Criminal Court. And beyond that, there's the whole family of UN organizations and agencies dealing with a variety of of affairs and policy areas. So why then do we need, after 73 years when we established all this and let it grow, why do we need then still to overcome the paradox of power? Why is it not functioning or not functioning well enough? In my daily life, as was just explained, I deal primarily with European affairs. I sit actually since July 1st in a committee of permanent representatives, we usually call it by the French name, Collier, of 28 ambassadors. Croatia joined the Union on July 1st. And what we do there is we either, through negotiations, try to establish legislation or political solutions to questions that are common to all 28, and to formulate foreign policy goals, not just in the classical sense foreign policy, but certainly also in the economic sense. And we prepare council meetings. We prepare the European Council, that is the 28 heads of state and government. We prepare the Foreign Affairs Council. We prepare the Justice and Home Affairs Council. We prepare the ECOFIN Council. And so the areas where we usually are concentrating on issues as that you would find them in the papers, saving the union. The current focus is on what we call the banking union. It's on issues such as Schengen, conducting solid policies that govern the way people can enter the Schengen area and then subsequently make use of the freedom to move about throughout the Schengen area. Provide the EU with a fair budget. Now, since we are Dutch, fair is not exactly what everyone in the world would always see fair. We're looking after every penny, and we think that it is important to have a fair share of the burden of providing the budget, certainly these days. And you can imagine that amongst 28 states that requires quite a bit of negotiation. So you might ask, why would I then speak about a UN-focused or UN-centered subject? Well, I dare say in some of my previous jobs, amongst them when I was serving Minister van Aartsen, I dealt quite a bit with the UN, both in terms of peacekeeping operations, but also I had the privilege of 5 times being a delegate to the General Assembly. And I see a lot of relationships and actually interaction between Europe and the UN. So let me try to say a few words on the theme for this week, but then definitely from this European perspective. I must say then, you mentioned at the beginning there are no cameras. I am going to try to be very honest, but at the same time, I'm serving my government, so whatever I speak is supposed to be on behalf of my government. I hope you will not abuse that, what I will be saying and sharing with you. I must start to make my first point with a personal experience. In 1979, I did an internship at the UN headquarters in New York. I worked under Brian Urquhart, and who was then the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, and he asked me to work on a number of questions that he had with respect to the Cyprus issue, the Cyprus question, as it's usually mentioned in UN lingo. We discussed primarily how 5 years after the intervention on the island, it would be possible to get all parties back to the conference table. And he thought that since I was totally new to thinking about the Cyprus question, the Netherlands diagonally across the continent moved away from Cyprus, that perhaps I had some creative or new ideas that he hadn't heard of yet. Of course, this wasn't the case, but now we're 24 years later. We still have, 34 years, I think, later, and we still have in Cyprus UNFICYP, the UN force in Cyprus, and there's still no solution to the Cyprus question. That presence over there is quite expensive. yet it is indispensable. If the blue helmets, if the peacekeeping force wouldn't be there, we would have had conflicts over the past couple of years repeatedly, even after all these years. Now, does that mean that the UN is incapable of solving conflicts like these, which in essence aren't all that complicated? I think most of us here, most of you certainly, if you would sit together with a little group and you would sort of make a list, like how would the compromise perhaps work, you would probably come up with something which would be fairly fair. So it's usually not the matter of, like, cannot somebody think up something bright? No, the question is much deeper. Why are parties not willing to sit together and exactly try to work out such a list? In fairness, and in defending the UN, I must actually say that the UN was pretty close, twice. In 2004, here in The Hague, we had a conference. Secretary General Kofi Annan was there. It was in the former Stadhuis, not far away from here. And 2 years later, with again under the auspices of the UN in Switzerland, actually then an agreement was reached. It was adopted in a referendum on the northern side of the island. Unfortunately, it was rejected on the southern part of the island. And since then, we're still pretty much in a stalemate. It shows, in a way, one of the core problems, and actually it has been mentioned, this element before, one of the core problems for the UN acting in a supranational way, acting in a way as saying, like, this is the solution which we collectively have decided upon. It's the limits that sovereignty put on the system. And although the UN has this legal monopoly on the use of violence, of armed strength, of armed forces, the political reality, as we all know, is quite different. States, groups, and individuals simply do not respect that legal fundamental rule. So it is important, if we want to make the UN, international organizations, to function better in dealing with conflicts, to look deeper to why, what are the origins of conflict. Let me just name three. There are many more areas through which, or prisms through which one could look at these. As a criminal lawyer, you would probably say it's individuals. Individuals acting outside the law, and they should face punishment for that. And there are many examples, of course. Indeed, the fact that we have the Tribunal on former Yugoslavia here in this town, and that proceedings against Mr. Karadzic and Mr. Mladic are still going on, is testimony to, indeed, this notion that it is in the end people who commit the acts, people who are culpable of the conflicts, of organizing and perpetuating the conflicts that we're talking about. But then there's, of course, also the social economic root of conflicts. Joost mentioned a number of these factors: poverty, lack of resources or access to resources, food, water. And this is a very real and visible problem. Only last week, with all the turmoil going on in Egypt, the Egyptian Foreign Ministry issued a declaration, which was actually rather stiff, addressed to Ethiopia because of the policies that Ethiopia is conducting in terms of irrigation works that they are building in the Blue Nile, which feeds into the Nile. And for Egypt, this is, in all terms, you would say this is a classic casus belli, to deprive a country that is lower along the river from the water that it has been counting on for thousands of years, of course. And then political, let me just issue the third sort of big one that I see as source of conflicts. That's a lack of democracy. Now, democracy comes in many ways. But fundamentally, in a situation where a country is governed by leaders who are not responsive or accountable to the people they are governing, then in the end, the only argument for their action is the perpetuation of their position and their personal gain. And obviously they organize that under the pretext of parties and ideologies, but the lack of democracy and the lack of the rule of law is at the heart of many of the international and intrastate conflicts that we are facing. And the UN was never designed to work exactly on all of these things. It is indeed only in this century that we're living that we have the International Criminal Court, whereby we made the step from not only states being subject at the ICJ, states being subject to international jurisprudence, but also individuals being tried before an international court that is global, although unfortunately not every member state of the UN is now part to the ICC. And one other positive thing is, I do think the sovereignty that we have been discussing is gradually eroding. Non-interference in domestic affairs has been for decades in UN meetings sort of an excuse for not allowing other member states to discuss matters in your country. It has been an excuse because indeed it was the covering of the acts of governments that were not democratically elected and accountable. The responsibility to protect, of which the mayor spoke, is an enormous step forward. It builds on some 40 years of discussion amongst lawyers, international lawyers in the world. It is something which is also dynamic. It is still very much developing. By no means we're in agreement globally on what the responsibility to protect eventually may entail. Here in the Netherlands, we have a certain inclination to assume immediately that whenever a government is not responsive to its population's interests in the way that we think it should be, that then sort of automatically the international community has the obligation to act. Well, by far most countries in the world do not see it that way. The responsibility to protect is primarily the responsibility of the state for its own people. And other states can talk with the state and say, like, I don't think that you're doing things right. And it's only at the very end of the spectrum, so to speak, that one comes to the notion of intervention, including military intervention. Syria is a case in point, has been mentioned. But also there, I must admit that it's not. Why then doesn't the UN, when the case is so clear, more than 100,000 people have been have lost their lives, and more than 1.5 million of people are on the move, have fled inside the country or outside the country? Why doesn't the UN act? Is the UN as an institution or as a body to be blamed for that? Most people in this part of the world would then easily point at Russia and China. I think it is too easy, too simple to say like that because of 2 permanent members of the Security Council not agreeing with us on the way to deal with that situation. I think we must be honest, and I would hope that that would be part of the dilemmas that you are going to be discussing this week, that it is, if we look at ourselves with all the desire that we have to come to the rescue of Syrian people and help them establish rule of law, help them establish a measure of democracy, we must also confess to ourselves that we don't have a plan. We must confess that we are divided. Alone in the European Union, we have had now repeated debates and deep divisions as to whether giving up on an arms embargo, we have a European arms embargo vis-à-vis Syria, but as you know, because of the situation in the Security Council, the UN has not established an arms embargo against Syria. So indeed, Russia and Qatar and many other countries can easily provide and legally provide arms to either the government in Syria or the regime or the rebels. We in the European are debating this. But the real question, of course, is would it be helpful, would it be a positive thing to give either party or faction amongst the coalition of opposing people to provide them with arms? What would be the effect? What would be our plan how to assist these people once they would have ousted the regime? That is the real kind of dilemma, and that one is facing. The immediate blaming of Russia is, as I said, and China, I think, is too simple. I think there's on the UN one other element when looking at these causes for conflict and indeed how to overcome the paradox of power. Two elements that I would think are useful to bring into the debate here. One, the General Assembly has, as I said, virtually universal membership, but at the same time it's not responsible. There are many examples of resolutions adopted by the General Assembly, majority of the General Assembly, and then where you can actually see that countries that not only voted for such a resolution, even perhaps made the resolution up, are then not living by that resolution. They're not legally binding. They're only politically binding, and there simply are too many. There are too many. It doesn't have the authority of a truly global body addressing global questions. And the Security Council has a different problem. It's obviously it's 15 members, and the composition and those that are permanent and those that are not permanent, as you all know, this is reflecting the situation in the world in 1945. And that's not reflecting the situation in 2013 or the years to come. This is a serious challenge for the UN because ultimately, if the majority of nations of the world do not feel adequately represented in the whole of the UN, that is both in the GA as well as in the Security Council, they will challenge, because of the lack of, so to speak, representativeness, they will start questioning the legitimacy. And that's, of course, the last thing that we would want to see. It's a real threat. The UN is, as a whole, is aware of this. For years now, there are debates within the UN on making the Security Council more representational. We in the Netherlands, actually, since the early 90s have first, I think it was in 1992, when we have publicly declared that we would want to contribute by having only one permanent European seat. That, of course, would help then also our internal discussions within the European Union. It would force us to speak with one mouth. But we would vacate, so to speak, a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. That could be filled by other new, big and important countries that should take responsibility for dealing with war and peace matters. Couple of final points to end this. Europe and its member states are the largest, together, are the largest contributor of official development aid in the world. We're the largest contributor to the UN budget, but politically our influence is rather limited. Has a lot to do with the fact that often we are divided. I take no pleasure or pride in saying this. We have to face the fact. We have to do our work internally better, come up with more common, solid positions. In this complex issue that you will be dealing here, I think that is something to take with you into your deliberations. admit that you start off with very different views and different interests, as Jo said correctly. To think that countries would not act in their own interests is naive. They will by definition. Even more, their politicians are elected by their citizens to work in their interest. So that is the starting point. The question is indeed, the challenge, if you want, is indeed how can we then sit together and make something creative out of these conflicting or competing challenges. There are no easy solutions to your dilemma, and I hope actually that I've added a few extra. There's no grand design that you can follow. You have to work with the existing structures. You have to use the normative effect of your arguments. That brings in also soft power. I'm a firm believer that the EU, while we don't have a European army, and for heaven's sake, I don't think that we need one, I do think, though, that we have enormous normative influence. What we do through our relationships with individual countries as well as with the multinational organizations. Soft power is real power. One should not immediately think in terms of sending in the army to solve issues. Afghanistan was mentioned. I've been doing a lot on Afghanistan in my previous job, and I honestly think that apart from the real military power that we took to that country, I think the lasting value of what we did there, and that's usually with these kind of operations, is what we did through the development and the diplomacy angles. This is something I would hope you would want to bring into your discussion. We like to think in these terms, the 3 Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development, the interaction between the 3 of them. Finally, what I consider thinking of the topic at hand is it is of crucial importance that we put our money where our mouth is. This is why I earlier said, it's very telling that now there's a picture taken of me, but when I said earlier, don't abuse what I'm going to be saying, we're a country that goes through an economic crisis. Actually, most of your countries probably are in the same position. I do think that it is of crucial importance that we contribute commensurate to the wealth that we still have and the ability that we have. We should continue to invest in that triangle of defense, diplomacy that I just mentioned, and that does mean that we must participate. Now, that would go for all of your countries. We must participate, we must be present, we must invest in the international system and implicitly thereby or indirectly invest in ourselves. Also, this goes for many of the other European member states. I think, although one hears these days other things, I think multilateralism is not outdated. I think it is as much needed as ever before, certainly in the 73 years since the Second World War. But it must be modernized, it must be reinvented, and especially it must be remodeled after the changed world, because the world has changed since in these 73 years. I hope that your conference is going to contribute to the thinking and working on that, and I do think that today is a very good day to start work on that. Thank you very much.